Welcome into the latest episode of the Dribble Drive. I am your host, Austin Render. Thanks so much for spending your time with us, whether you are doing that via the YouTube link or the podcast on Apple or Spotify. We really, really appreciate it. This is the Dribble Drive podcast, episode 9. It's been a ton of fun so far. We have a ton of previous episodes, teams like USC, UCLA, Illinois, Minnesota, Michigan State. If those are your type of podcast, go back, listen, subscribe, download, rate us. That's how we know that we're doing a good job. We've got plenty more previews coming up. Teams like Ohio State, Iowa, Indiana, Michigan, Oregon, etc. We're going to hit every team here before the season starts in that first week of November. So keep listening. Hit that subscribe button. We will continue to bring previews as we get into the season. Let's take a look at what's going on in the Big Ten. Last week, we did not do a Big Ten news segment. That episode was pre-recorded quite a bit earlier with Eli Kleinman of USC. So let's kind of run through some of the things we missed. Big Ten tournament sites announced for the next 4 years. We're going to be in Indianapolis the next 2, 25 and 26. Las Vegas and Detroit for the first time at each one of those in 27, and then Detroit in 28. So that will be a fun couple of trips there. Let's do some team-centered news. Couple of teams on foreign tours right now. Illinois is in Italy. They opened up with a 67-65 win a couple of days ago. As of this recording, Dahlia McKenzie, 11 points. Genesis Bryant, Barry Wallace, Kendall Bostic with 10. Bostic also had 15 rebounds. Purdue is also on a foreign tour. They're in Barcelona with an 84-39 opening win. Elena Harper led the team with 17 points. And a freshman name you may hear about some this season, Layden McCarthy, 15 points for the Boilermakers. Schedules are being announced. Cancun Challenge schedule out for both Iowa and Wisconsin. Iowa will open Thanksgiving Day with Rhode Island and Black Friday against BYU. Wisconsin will go San Diego State on Thanksgiving, Providence on Friday, VCU on Saturday. Minnesota is going to be in the Bryant Classic versus SMU and Oregon State, November 16th and 17th, and the Big Easy Classic, November 29th and 30th. Versus Houston and Louisiana. Maryland announced its home non-con schedule, highlighted by a November 10th date against Duke. Northwestern will be hosting Utah on November 14th. Ohio State will play Stanford at Invisalign Bay Area Classic December 20th. UCLA will be in that as well. They'll take on Creighton in the second half of that doubleheader. And a shout out to Michigan's Silas Swords, incoming freshman, the youngest player at the 2024 Olympic basketball games. She scored 10 points over 3 games of action for Team Canada. So that's your Big Ten news. And we've been doing previews, which have been great. We're going to continue to do those here until the beginning of the season. But I wanted to kind of take a step back. We've done a lot of team-centered previews, and this is an episode I'm super excited about. We're going to take a more broad look at the Big Ten. And to do that, we're bringing in ESPN's bracketologist and women's basketball reporter, Charlie Creme. Charlie, thanks so much for joining us. We're really excited. I'm really excited to have you on the show. Thanks so much for joining us.
I'm glad to do it, Austin. It's summertime. Other than the WNBA and the Olympics most recently, there hasn't been any hoops to dissect, and there hasn't been any on the college side, other than some of the, you mentioned some of the foreign tours, but the real nuts and bolts and the hardcore stuff of college hoops has been on the back burner for a while now. So it's fun to get back on and have a chat with somebody who's diving deep into it like yourself.
It's been a great outlet to talk about our favorite sport here for the past couple of months, starting this podcast. So you obviously probably best known as your bracketologist work on ESPN. It's something that I certainly monitor throughout the season. My top question is just simply, how does one get into bracketology? How did you kind of figure out this is something you wanted to do? And then we'll get into kind of the nuts and bolts of bracketology, but just kind of talk about the origin story of where you started getting into this.
Well, you could maybe call it a happy accident. I guess the story is somewhat long and broad, but it centers around my meeting Joe Lunardi, and this was Joe Lunardi before he was Joe Lunardi, ESPN men's basketball bracketologist. This was when we worked, and he was the editor, and I was merely a writer for Blue Ribbon College Basketball Yearbook on the men's side. And Joe's decision to advance that publication into a tournament preview guide as well And that required some pre-writing. There's obviously a quick turnaround between the selection show and the game starting. And I think in our second year doing that, we got burned by a couple of teams going into the field as at larges, Manhattan and Santa Clara, that we didn't write ahead of time. And we really we really needed to have every team written ahead of time so we could just kind of put them in order, put them in the publication, and get it in the mail to people, get it printed, and then get it in the mail to people so they could have it by Tuesday, so they could read it Tuesday, Wednesday, and prior to game starting on Thursday. So that led to Joe really not wanting to have that happen again, and really learning about the process of the selections, which was really behind the steel wall at that point. There wasn't much the NCAA revealed about how they did things, why they did things a certain way. And Joe really delved into that. And I was sort of riding shotgun at that point. So fast forward a few years, Joe had taken this concept, which he named bracketology, and I started his own website when I'm going back to Santa Clara and Manhattan making the turn. I'm going back to the mid '90s, so I'm going back quite a ways. I'm going back before the internet was really a big deal, which is, I think, for a lot of people listening, probably hard to believe because it's been such a part of our lives for most people listening's entire life. But this was a time when everything, for the most part, was still hardbound, and you had to read it, and you had to get it in the mail. And foreign times to a lot of people. But when the internet did become a thing, he started his own website, which eventually ESPN caught wind of and decided to buy him out and bring him in as the men's basketball bracketologist that he'd already sort of named himself. And then a few years after that, ESPN decided they wanted to add women's bracketology to their content. And he wasn't equipped to do it, but I had more of a background in women's basketball, and I was kind of Robin to his Batman at the beginning days of bracketology. And they called me, or he basically gave them my name, and they called me, and it just became a match made in bracketology lore. And essentially, it started very small. When I first started doing it for ESPN, it was really not that big a deal. I did a few mock brackets, maybe one in January, a couple in February, and then a big one right before the selections in March. Hardly talked about, hardly mentioned, just some added content to the website. And obviously, with the growth of the game and the growth of the concept of bracketology, and I lay that all at Joe's lap. He was the one who started this whole thing that's become a craze. And because of that, obviously bracketology on the women's side of ESPN has gotten that much bigger, and my role has expanded quite a bit along with that.
It really is crazy how much we look at that. I mean, I check it every time. I feel like I need to have like an alert every time you post a new one, because I'm basically always looking at the site, because when you got a team in the field, you want to see where they're at. And on the women's side, there's obviously more to it, because it's about not only am I in the tournament, am I hosting, that kind of thing. What seed am I going to be? That means a little bit more on the women's side of things. When you kind of sit down to create your brackets, what are some of the strategies you have? What are the difficulties that arise? How have you kind of fine-tuned this art of bracketology over the years?
Well, I try to mimic what the committee does. Now, it can't, obviously, we got a committee of 12 people. I'm a committee of one. I can't exactly do it the way they do, because they do a series of votes and where they place teams. And essentially, they're only doing it one time. They do those top 16 reveals where they'll look at those 16 teams, kind of give us an idea who may host. But for the most part, they're doing a full bracket just one time. I'm doing it. I'm to the point now where I can't even count how many I do during the season. It's quite a few, and it starts right at the beginning of the season now. So my process, though, is the criteria that I look at is the same stuff the committee looks at. It requires a lot of watching basketball and knowing what these teams are and making assessments on the teams based on what you see, but also the data. It's not one or the other exclusively. And I think that's where sometimes people get confused about that. It's like that bracketology is all about the numbers and crunching numbers, and it is to some degree, or a large degree, that, because you have to have quantifiable data to support what you're doing, and the committee does the exact same thing. But it's also watching these games and getting a sense of what these teams are, how they compete, where they are at a certain point in the season. So all of that factors in. But when I actually sit down and do it, I'm still kind of old school. I still have paper and pencil. I erase a lot. I move teams around a lot. And I do have sort of, I guess you could call them votes like the committee does, where I'll put lists of teams together, group teams based on the numbers, based on what I've seen, and then kind of vote on them myself and sort of rank them in small chunks. And then those teams go into the 1 through 68 list, and then we kind of keep moving down. And then there's things like, I have to make some assumptions on automatic qualifiers and things like that. So I generally kind of keep a rule of who's ever leading the conference at the time. If we're still in the non-conference season, it's generally speaking who has the best winning percentage at the time. I'm talking about some of the smaller leagues where they're only going to be getting one bid. But the process is as similar as I can make it to the committee. To kind of sum it up, it's creating a list of 61 through 68, and then I think, Austin, you asked me about what's the most challenging part of it. The bracketing part is often the most challenging. There are certain rules in bracketing that they've eased up over the years in terms of where teams can be placed based on other teams in their conference and things like that. But there are still things you have to follow. You can't put a 1 and a 2 seed from the same conference in the same region, things like that. So sometimes it's a puzzle you're putting together, and sometimes some weeks, especially when it's early in the season and there's not a lot of data and there's not a lot of games having been played yet. It's a puzzle that not all the pieces fit. And I'll go round and round and round of how do I actually put these teams in the bracket to follow all the rules. And I will always try to follow all the rules. If sometimes I make mistakes, but it's not because I'm intentionally breaking a bracketing rule. It's because maybe I overlooked something. But that's the most challenging part is fitting all those pieces together, following the bracketing rules, and making the bracket make sense based on what the committee has outlined as the rules of the game, so to speak.
Yeah, and I'm interested with how these quote unquote super conferences are coming together now. I mean, the Big Ten is going to have 18 teams, the SEC is going to have 16 teams. Are they going to have to be more flexible with some of those bracketing rules? Are there going to be some times where maybe some conference teams are going to have to be placed closer together in the bracket than maybe they previously were?
There's no question. They haven't announced any changes to that kind of stuff just yet. I think once we get closer to the season, we'll get some clarity on exactly how that's going to work. But there's no question they have over the course of the last few years eased some of those things where, as long as you haven't played each other 3 times in the season, you can meet in the regional semifinals. It used to be that was just, you couldn't do it. And that's been relaxed over the last few years. They still bracket teams where they try to keep the top teams in the league away from each other. Mm-hmm. And that's still a rule. You can't be in the same region with another team if you're a top 4 seed, another team in your unless there's more than 4, and then obviously then we get into some things. But they still, the attempt to spread conference teams out as much as they can so they're not meeting early in the tournament is still part of the process. Now, how much can that remain part of the process when because you're going to have this year, you're going to have the potential for double-digit teams from either the SEC or the Big Ten in the tournament. And then it becomes a mathematical impossibility. So we'll see what they say officially. I know what they've always done officially and somewhat unofficially in trying to keep these teams spread from each other. But obviously it gets harder and harder now. So I guess to be determined exactly what the rules are going to be. But you're still not going to see first round matchups, for instance, of teams in the same conference. I really, really doubt. And I doubt you'll see second round matchups, although I think we're creeping closer and closer to that being a possibility. And it has happened occasionally on the men's side in years past, where the second round meetings happen between teams in the same league. It's possible that could happen this year, but I still think the committee will do everything in its power to keep these teams separated and have the chances of same teams in the Big Ten, for instance, meeting each other earlier than they have to.
Yeah, and let's talk a little Big Ten. You mentioned that you could see the potential of double-digit teams making it out of this Big Ten conference. 7 the last 2 years. Now you add 4 teams, all very good teams coming into the conference. Your May bracketology, for whatever that's worth, has 9 Big Ten teams in it. There's got to be a world where, while you're looking at double-digit teams making it out of one conference, this Big Ten conference, I feel like could have an argument as maybe the best conference, maybe the deepest conference in the country.
It certainly could. There's no question about it. I think I also have Minnesota as a last or first team out.
Yeah, first 4
So
out. Yep.
we're whiskers away from the double digits we just talked about. If you believe bracketology in May is going to apply to bracketology in mid-March, but I'm not saying I've been super accurate with I've whiffed on a lot of teams when I do my really early, but for the most part, I think if you looked from, and I've never really done this. I mean, this is kind of jogging my brain a little bit. Maybe I should take a look at my years past and see how I did in May versus what actually came out in March. But a lot of these teams are going to be there. No question about certain teams, and then there's obviously the question marks we talk about. So I think in both of the leagues that we've mentioned so far, that Big Ten and SEC, we could be looking at them gobbling up well over, or close to, I should say, maybe 20 spots of the 68 in the field, and the Big Ten is deep, as you said, and I think it's going to be kind of a battle between the Big Ten and the SEC based on who's deep. The SEC, I think, from SEC standards, has been down the last couple of years. I think this year it's going to be back. Now, adding Oklahoma and Texas certainly helps. Those are 2 tournament teams. Texas could be one of the best teams in the country.
Yep.
But obviously on the Big Ten side, you've added 2 top 5 teams in USC and UCLA. So depth, there's different ways to measure, the quality of a conference, right? Depth obviously is certainly one of them. Quality at the top is also another one that you really look at, and there's plenty of quality at the top in both of these leagues, and it's just so ironic with this shift in conferences and these teams being added and these conferences getting so big, that what the Big Ten is adding this year is so good. And on the women's basketball side, it's almost unfair. It's somewhat reminiscent, I guess, when Maryland came into the league. Mm-hmm. They were already the best team in the league as soon as they came in. Yep. And I think you can certainly make a very, very strong case that you see USC, UCLA are 1-2 in the Big Ten, boom, right out of the chute. And if this expansion had happened 5 years ago, that's not even close to being true. It's just that those 2 programs have elevated at a time when college football is changed everything.
Absolutely. Last 2 years, there's been a 1 seed from the Big Ten, Indiana 2 years ago, and Iowa last year. Ohio State a 2 seed last year. Feels like UCLA and USC are the 2 that are going to push for that this year. You have USC as a 1 and UCLA as a 2. Is there anybody else in the Big Ten that you think could contend for a 1 or 2 seed, or maybe even let's just branch out to teams that could be host schools out of the Big Ten?
I think there's a kind of a big drop off after the 2 schools formerly known from the Pac-12. I think that I'm trying to think where I think Ohio State could certainly threaten it for a hosting spot.
You've got them as a 4. Yep.
Yeah. And there's a lot of questions because this team has been a lot of this team's been remade with transfers, and sometimes it works right away and it clicks. Other times it takes some time. We saw, for instance, with LSU, they were everybody's number 1 going into last year, right? The national champs, and then they added all this talent through the portal, and the first game out, they got boat raced by Colorado. Yeah. And the chemistry was obviously not there early in the season. So Ohio State will be one of those teams we're going to have to watch closely to see how the chemistry starts, how it evolves. And, I anticipate it'll be a very different team in February than it is in November. But, like the play of Cody McMahon is going to have a lot to do with that. I thought in some ways she took a step backwards last year. And if she is back to the All-American that I thought she was going to be last year, I had her as pegged as the next breakout star. And not just she did not have a bad year by any means. I'm not saying that. But it wasn't the progress that I felt like I expected. If she does make that jump this year, she becomes the centerpiece of, I think, of a very good team. If the pieces the new faces that come in around her figure out their roles. So Ohio State could certainly threaten for a spot to host. I'm curious. I mean, similar philosophy or discussion points around Maryland.
Yeah.
How good can Maryland be? Are they going to be good enough to be a host? I don't know, but I think if the pieces all fit, and we know Brenda Fries has done a lot of good things bringing in transfers and making it work, that if around Cheyenne Sellers, they can build some of these new faces to a chemistry that works. I think they're going to be and Brenda Fries loves for teams to rebound. I think they have a chance to be a really, really dominant rebounding team. If that works out, I think maybe Maryland is another team that could threaten for a hosting spot. I think some of the other teams that I have in the tournament lost too much to probably seriously threaten to get into that top 16. A team like Iowa, obviously, I think there's still a lot of talent there, but coaching change, losing Caitlin Clark, losing some other key seniors as well.
It wasn't just her.
Kate Martin and Gabby Marshall were massive to the evolution of that program, and they're gone as well. But I still think there's talent there, and they're good enough to be a tournament team. But I don't. Given the fact that some of these teams are going to beat each other up in the Big Ten, we just talked about how deep the league is. So there's going to be a decent amount of numbers, higher numbers in that L column. It's going to make it, I think, a little difficult for these teams that are adjusting to new things to have a resume that gets them into the top 16, because November, December is very important. It's that non-conference schedule, and most of these teams play decent non-conference schedules. But if you don't actually win any games, or you struggle in those better games on your non-conference, it's still reflected on your resume when we come to March. And if these teams do kind of struggle in the beginning to put those new pieces together, then I think we're looking at very limited chances of any more of those teams threatening to host.
Yeah, I think that's fair. One of my questions I had on here was about Maryland, because it is a brand new roster. I think Maryland and Oregon lead the conference in transfers coming in. There is a lot of excitement about this Maryland team. You feel like with Brenda Fries, they made the tournament, but you would consider last year a down year. Doesn't feel like Brenda Fries is going to have 2 down years in a row. So I think a lot of people excited about that Maryland team. You've got Nebraska as a 5 and Illinois as a 6. They're both in your way too early top 25 as well. I'm not saying that that's the title of the top 25, but
yeah.
But I mean,
still
maybe
way too early, by the way. But we like to call that so people don't get too excited about this being etched in stone. So that's kind of our out pitch. We call it way too early, so people understand that we also know it's pretty early.
Correct. None of us know what's going to happen. There's going to be teams that surprise us. There's going to be teams we don't see coming. But you're higher on Nebraska and Illinois than maybe some of the other teams like Indiana and Iowa, who have lost a lot from last year. Talk me through kind of where you see Nebraska and Illinois sitting coming into the season.
Well, I think they have both those teams have more coming back than the teams we just mentioned, the Iowas and the Marylands, and so it's not quite as new. And I think going back to what we just talked about is you'd like to think, I'm not necessarily one that subscribes to that there's momentum that necessarily carries from one season to the next. I think every season is different. It's its own chapter in a big book. But that said, Illinois disappointed last year considerably. I thought they were going to be much better, but they did finish on an uptick, winning the WNIT, and they brought everybody back. So I think there's got to be something there. And you mentioned in your news about their going overseas, that sometimes really helps a program. So I'm thinking that the expectations that many of us had for Illinois last year will actually manifest itself this year. It's a super experienced team, tons of seniors, tons of talent. If they're if they play to that level that I think everybody measures them, as individually talented, and there's a little bit better chemistry than they kind of showcased last year for most of the season. I do think Illinois has a chance to be pretty good. Nebraska, they have Markowski back, and that having that centerpiece is huge, and they can, being able to rely on her night in and night out. She's very consistent. That gives them someone to turn to in the tough moments, and they have a lot of younger players, but they do have they already had some experience in big game situations. So I think Nebraska has a chance to. Nebraska is a team I think it could have a big pendulum, though, depending on how some of these freshmen from last year, what kind of leap they take as sophomores.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. I mean, you got the Big Ten co-freshman of the year and Natalie Potts coming in there, and a player that certainly could make some difference. They've got some incoming freshmen coming in that could be really good. We had Matt Coatney of Nebraska's radio network come join us, so go listen to that. If you're a Nebraska fan, you want to hear all about the Cornhuskers, a team we haven't previewed yet because I'm trying to stay away from it on my end for the bias purposes, is Indiana. I'm going to have somebody on at some point. We'll preview them, but I just want to hear your thoughts on where Indiana might be. Obviously, they lose Mackenzie Holmes. They lose Sarah Scalia. They bring back the rest of the team. Those are the only two people they lost. Nobody transferred out, but those are obviously two big holes. You have them as an 8 seed preseason outside your top 25. Is there something that if this happens, Indiana could jump up higher in your bracketology?
Yeah, I think it really hinges. And this is one of those situations where if Holmes only had one more year, if they only had that experienced post player to go with all of these shooters, because they did lose Scalia, but they gained some other shooters, right? Chesky should be almost kind of sub her in for that role of what Scalia played, and they still have a bunch of really good shooters, but they don't have much experience in the post, and Holmes was so experienced and so good. So I think the tipping point will be how do the freshman bigs perform? Are they ready to play Big Ten basketball? It's going to be tough, right? There's a lot of good big players in the Big Ten, and Indiana is going to be going at it with a lot of inexperience. But if there's some evolution there as the season goes on, and those players get better, then Indiana has a chance to be, a much better team, like we've talked about with some of these others in the winter than they will be in the fall. But they have a ton of shooters, and basketball now is a shooter's game. If they can figure out how to get open shots for some of their veteran shooters, then I think Indiana has a chance. It's such a deep league, though. It's going to be very tough night in and night out. They're going to be in real bad mismatch situations with, for instance, how is Indiana going to defend Lauren Betts when that, when that meeting happens of UCLA? Those are the kind of things I wonder about. Can Indiana compete on the interior with some of the schools like Maryland? We talked about Maryland, and they've added a bunch of size and a bunch of physicality. How is Indiana going to compete there? Ohio State's always a very physical team. How is Indiana going to compete there? And if they figure out a way to do that and play to their strengths, which I think is going to be their perimeter shooting, then Indiana can win some games and be in the upper half of the league. And I think that would probably, the upper half of the Big Ten, I guess maybe upper half now is a little difficult to say with there's
that's 9 teams at this point.
Maybe top 6. Maybe top 6 is what I should probably refer to it as now. They could maybe be higher than an 8 seed.
But the thing is, I think if you finish in the upper half, the top 9 in the Big Ten, you're probably going to be a tournament team.
Yeah.
And as seasoned as you'll be out of this league, you'll probably be capable of making a run. Are you really going to want to see like an Indiana or an Iowa who ends up being an 8 as a 1 seed? Like that's kind of, I mean, this league's going to have some potential, I think, to have teams 1 through 8 or 9 be capable of making a run deep into March. And it'll be an interesting year for Indiana because the Terry Morin tenure has basically just all been up. It's just been a gradual incline, and this is the first year where people are expecting them to take a step back, and we'll see how they handle that. Michigan State was a team last year that kind of caught everybody by surprise. Robin Freilic's first year, they end up getting into the tournament. They were one and done, but still a huge year of progress for Michigan State. You've got them as a 7 seed. Where do you see them sitting in the landscape of the Big Ten preseason?
I think for Michigan State, I look at it as like the 7 seed might be the ceiling. Okay. Kind of the more I think about it. You're right. They had a really good, surprising year last year, and it was, to see that kind of progress, I think was probably very, very uplifting for Spartan faithful. And I think they have a chance to be really good again. The transfer portal is such a big part of what the sport is now. It's the coaches that can incorporate the new faces quickly and create a season long narrative, so to speak, of progress. Because it's difficult for most of these programs across the country, not just in the Big Ten, to just put their stamp on things right from the get-go and maintain that for the course of an entire season. So it's, as a coach, and I would certainly put Robin Freilich in this category with Michigan State, because you want to figure out how you get your chemistry and your continuity at its peak later in the season. You don't want to kind of jam everything down everybody's throats right away and trying to win games in November and December, and at the cost of having things start to break apart later in the season. I think and with veteran teams, sometimes we see that they're ready to go right from the chute, and then there's something that just peters out later in the season. Michigan State's not in that position necessarily, but they've got a nice mix of veterans and new faces and youth, where I think Coach Freilich can kind of build that as the season goes on. But that's going to be I think that's going to be the key there. I think from just a sheer talent standpoint, I think that's where maybe I say the 7 seed is the ceiling, and I don't really necessarily see Michigan State as having I don't think they're going to fall for much farther from that, but I don't think they really have a chance to grow much beyond the 7 seed either. And that's why I put it as kind of their high watermark, because I think that the talent is what it is. And we've talked about some of these other teams that have the possibility of a bigger ceiling because of, transfers getting better as the season goes on, or young players evolving as the year progresses. I kind of see Michigan State being kind of what they are. But if Robin Freilich can take that, as I said that at the beginning, that narrative, and kind of take it along, then maybe I'll be wrong about that. But I kind of see them being sort of, I don't see them being a much different team in February, for instance, that I see them in November. I see them maybe kind of being very much the same, whereas some teams will be very different in the later stages of the year than they will be at the beginning.
Yeah, I think Michigan State's a team that you kind of know what you're getting from them, but they're not going to be an easy out any night. That's a team that took a huge step forward last year. And I think what you're doing is you're giving all these teams great bulletin board material here in the month of August. They're going to be like, all right, Charlie says we're 7's the ceiling. Let's see if we can beat it. Michigan's a team you do not have in your bracketology preseason. It's a team under Kim Barnes-Arico that has basically been a tournament staple. But this is a totally different Michigan team. They lose Layla Filia to Texas. They do have some incoming talent in the freshman class, but it's going to be a whole new challenge for Kim Barnes-Arico this year. What do you see when you look at this Michigan roster?
It's just too new. That's my simplest way to put it. I thought, if they could have kept Filia and had that as a centerpiece, then maybe this could have been a tournament team. But there's just who do you turn to in big moments right now? It's sort of a starting over period, and it's coming at a really bad time when the conference expands. These high level of talent coming into the league. I just see Michigan really, really struggling. Kim Barnes-Arico is a fabulous coach. The program has gotten to places that has really never consistently been under her. But they just, over the last couple of years, they've just lost too much. And it's just, there's too much to try to replace. I don't know where Michigan was in the action for some of the big name transfers that were out there, but they didn't land any, comparatively to the rest of the league, some of the other teams in the league, like a Maryland, or I mean even in Indiana, adding a couple of pieces. So I really think Michigan's going to struggle because the league is we talked about it, this league's so deep. Where do you go to the schedule and say, oh, Michigan can win that game, win that game, win that game?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously we'll see things when we get going here, but trying to forecast in the summertime, and you look at the talent, you compare the talent levels across the league, and pretty much everybody on Michigan's roster at some level is unknown. And there's so much we do know about many of these other teams in the league. I just don't know where they're going to be able to seriously compete right now.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. It's a team that we don't know much about. It is going to be a totally new team. It is going to be a team that, hey, maybe in February we're talking about, man, how good of a coaching job has Kim Barnes-Arico done with this team? They're 7th in the standings right now and projected to be a tournament team. But I don't think it's unfair to say there's a lot of unknowns with this team, and we'll see what they can do. And like you said, it's so hard to rebuild in this league right now because the league is so good from top to pretty much 1 through, you can say 18, but for the most part, 1 through 13, 14, it's all going to be really, really good teams. And it's going to be so hard for those teams 15 through 18 to rebuild and kind of get any sort of traction in this league. With that being said, any surprises out of the Big Ten? We mentioned you've got 9 teams in the field preseason: USC, UCLA, Ohio State, Nebraska, Illinois, Maryland, Michigan State, IU, Iowa. We've touched on pretty much every one of those teams. Minnesota and Washington are in your first 8 out in some order there. Any surprises that you could see, and you could include Minnesota and Washington in that could maybe make a jump from out of the tournament into the tournament by March?
Not really. I just think, and it's a lot of things we've hit on already, is the depth of the league. We really know that those top teams, USC, UCLA, and then we get into the Ohio States and the Nebraskas and the Marylands, that those are going to be good teams. And you're going to have to, anybody who's going to surprise is going to have to win games that we really just right now cannot possibly see coming. So so teams like Minnesota and Washington, they're close enough in my mind to make the tournament. So it's going to come down to, hey, can they pull? It's really going to come down to a few games. Can they pull that surprise? Can Washington win at Ohio State? Can Minnesota go host Maryland and pull off a surprise? Will USC fall to one of these teams when Juju Watkins just has a 3 for 18 night, something like that? If they can do that, then they move up past some teams and now they're closer to knocking on the door of being in the field. But from a team, from anybody that's going to really surprise me, I don't think so. I think maybe a team like Purdue that's always been a decent program, but it's really kind of, it's been a few steps back the last couple of years, perhaps lightning in a bottle, but it's the league is so deep. You're going to have to win a lot of games against a lot of good teams to get yourself seriously in the conversation. And the country is so deep. And so it makes it very difficult to really pinpoint someone who, I guess if I could easily pinpoint a surprise team, I'd probably have them in the mix already. I guess maybe that's what I'm trying to say, is that we're already down to, we've mentioned 11 teams from the league as being in the mix. That's pretty good, right? That's a lot to digest. For anybody else to move into that category, I think we probably would have already hit on them, and it's going to be difficult for some of those programs that have really struggled. Their job just got a lot more difficult with the addition of those 4 teams.
Yes, that's the issue with a lot of these teams is you got to make such a big jump to get into that upper echelon. of the conference. Well, what we'll do, Charlie, is we'll screenshot your May bracketology. We'll write down your thoughts from this podcast, and then in February we'll bring you back on and we'll see how you did. And we'll do what you wanted to do. You wanted to do a little thought exercise on how your preseason bracketology is, and we'll let the Michigan fans throw tomatoes electronically at you if they're sitting pretty.
When I have them projected as a 6 seed because they've shocked the world, and I'm like, wait, no, I know we erased that tape. I had them all the way.
Yeah, correct. We can't. It's funny. We're here in February. We can't find the May bracketology. I think Charlie must have scrubbed it from the records. But no, it's been wonderful picking your brain. I love talking bracketology, even in mid-August. It's great to see. I think fans like to know where their teams sit here. Because, and I'm sure this makes your job even more difficult, at least in the preseason version, with all the transfers. We don't know what these teams are until they really hit the floor and start playing each other. So it's hard to prognosticate where they're going to end up. So I think fans just like to see, hey, just a little thing of in August, this is where Charlie sees my team at right now.
And that's where things change so much. And fortunately, we were able to do this bracket after most 90+% of any important transfers, or impactful transfers is probably the right word, landed. So we kind of knew where everybody was going to be, but how those things fit, whole different story. And we won't know that until we start playing games in November. So, but we'll probably have a couple more brackets with some tweaks before we hit the court in November. It probably won't be dramatically different, but there'll be maybe some adjustments, because sometimes I change my mind too. I do reassess, or there might have been a player I overlooked, or a group of players that I see differently come September than I did in May. So there might be some tweaks. So look for those, and certainly let's do that breakdown of May to March and see what I did. And
I have a feeling
I can take the tomatoes coming at me.
We're gonna have electronic tomatoes thrown at your screen. No, I have a feeling that you're gonna be pretty busy in March, so maybe we'll do it in February. But either way,
that works.
We'll figure something out to do that. But this has been wonderful. I'm so excited for basketball season. I wish it were starting tomorrow, but we are getting closer. Shortly but surely, we are approaching basketball season. Charlie, thanks so much for spending some time with us.
You got it, Austin. I was happy to do it. It was fun.
Well, that was the 9th episode of the Dribble Drive podcast. We're on Apple. We're on Spotify. We're on the Back Home Network YouTube channel. Come check us out. All our episodes, all our previews, backlogged for you there. We'll be doing plenty more previews as we go. We'll talk to you guys next Monday. For Charlie Creme, I'm Austin Render on the Dribble Drive.